So traditionally, the bicycle has been driven by a set of gears which are pretty obvious to see. They're formed of a cassette, a rear mech, a shifter, a couple of chain rings and a chain, and the chain shifts across the cassette driven by the derailleur.
But there is another way, and that's of course the gearbox or the hub gear. They're not quite as common, but they do have a number of advantages. The main thing is having your gears enclosed in a box means that they're away from the elements. That means that dirt can't get in there, which means that wear is sort of slower. You're not going to get that accelerated wear. However, there are some drawbacks to them.
I guess the main one is, well, weight. They tend to be relatively heavy and a lot of that weight is centred in one place. Now that can be an advantage because it's not centred around the back wheel, generally speaking, unless you use a roll-off. It's centred in the middle of the frame, which is where we want that weight. But they are undeniably heavier. They're also quite expensive compared to a traditional derailleur-based system.
So we have mentioned hub gears as well as gearboxes. I'm sure you're going to fill the comments with hatred now, but for mountain biking, hub gears aren't really ideal. The problem is that you've got all that weight centred on the rear wheel. So if you've got a suspension bike, you've got a very, very heavy rear wheel.
There is an increasing number of viable alternatives though. Pinion, for example, have been working a lot with Nicolai, and there's also FE Gear. And these two companies create gearboxes which sit within the frame, so the weight is centralised and low in the frame, meaning that you don't have that big mass of stuff hanging off the back of your bike.
So especially for suspension bikes, this has a number of advantages. Moving all the gears away from that rear wheel means that you can make a much lighter rear wheel, which means that the suspension is much more responsive. It also means that you can have an undished rear wheel, so if you have it evenly braced, the wheel's going to be much, much stronger.
The other thing, I guess, is that you've got a consistent chain line, so you can have a chain which is always straight, or a belt, so you don't have to have this cross-chaining and extra wear like that, so that adds to the durability. And you also don't have a derailleur hanging down there waiting to be smashed by rocks and roots and logs.
The really important thing for a lot of bike designers when you're creating suspension is the anti-squat figures. Basically, that's how the bike suspension reacts to a load through the chain. Often, sort of bike designers will design it so in a certain chain ring, the suspension starts to stiffen up, which resists sort of like bob and pedalling input. It does also mean that you get kickback through the pedal, but that's probably a topic for a different day. So basically, by having a fixed cog and another fixed cog, you can design it to work ideally just in those things. You don't sort of go, well, it needs to work in this big cog and that little cog. How's it going to react here or how's it going to react there? You design the figures once and then it's perfect as far as you're concerned. That's a lot of the theory behind it, but how does it actually ride in the real world? Well, we've both had a go on a Nicolai equipped with a Pinion 12 speed box, and I found it very interesting, but I guess we'll go with your impressions first.
First off, I mean, the system worked pretty well. The gear shift is relatively snappy, it's relatively quick. You can change gear when you're not pedalling. You can't really change gear when you're pedalling hard, so there's a bit of a compromise like that. It was quite nice having all the weight centred in the bike, so the bike did actually feel really planted. There's a few things I didn't like about it. The bike wasn't particularly light. The shifter I did not get on with at all. The ergonomics of it is not great. You've sort of got, it's a grip shift. Yeah. And with these gearboxes, there aren't really any, or at least many, trigger shifter systems out there. So you're going back to grip shift, which is a bit 90s for me, really.
The reason that they have to use a grip shifter rather than a trigger shifter, with the gearbox you need to be able to pull the gearbox both ways, which means that you need two cables feeding into it, so for going up and then for going down. That was one of the biggest things that I didn't like about the Pinion gearbox. The second is that it, like you mentioned, it really doesn't like shifting under power.
No.
It's okay, you can shift sort of when you're not pedalling, but if you're putting in hard effort, you can't force a shift, you have to absolutely back off.
Takes a lot of getting used to though.
Yeah.
You have to readdress your pedalling and your shifting sort of attitude. And when you go back to a regular STI or, you know, like a trigger shifter based system, it's a breath of fresh air again. It's such a relief to be able to just shift as you know, and it's always a bit lighter, it always feels a bit better, less clunky. It's just a more refined system. I
assume as gearbox technology develops, maybe they will get smoother, but at the moment you need quite a large amount of force to make a change gear. On the plus side, especially on that Nicolai, the suspension performance, because you've got a very light wheel, it's noticeably better, like very impressive. So if you hit sort of fast, rooty, rocky sections, you don't feel that the rear wheel is getting hung up on things. It literally just sort of like...
It's just buttery smooth over everything.
Yeah. We haven't measured it with science, but subjectively, every gearbox or hub gear that we've tried has felt considerably more draggy than a comparable derailleur setup.
And that sort of psychology of it does make a difference to how you feel about a product when you're, you know, riding up an Alp or something. If you feel that your legs are churning out more watts than you're actually getting out the back wheel, it's a bit of a downer on the way the bike feels,
Yeah,
to be
it can
honest.
be quite disheartening. And I think, again, subjectively for me, at the end of a long day on that Gearbox bike, my legs felt far emptier than they would have done on a similar ride on a different bike.
Yeah.
I'd say if I lived somewhere where I had lots of ski lifts and it's sort of rocky and sort of like, you know, you'd be tearing off mechs or damaging things, banging them on rocks, and I didn't have to pedal uphill an awful lot, then I kind of go, yeah, this makes sense, because I could just have, you know, the one sort of transmission, and that'd last, you know, several seasons out in the mountains. It's just not going to wear down, there's nothing really to get beaten.
So if we're going to see gearboxes on a lot more bikes, I guess trail bikes, we think that we need to address things like the weight, the price, and also the frame mounting system. So they're bolted onto a frame. With derailleurs, you've got a pretty universal standard of how it all fits together, say for a few different bottom bracket standards. With a gearbox, you've got a big chunk of metal and you've got to bolt it to a frame, and it doesn't bolt to a normal frame.
So there is a future for gearboxes. Whether it's the current one, probably not. Whether it's something different, but it's an interesting technology, and it's definitely something to keep your eyes peeled for.